Tony Curtis said something and Johnny Carson's face changed. He left his desk and started moving quickly toward his guest. Before the audience could understand what was happening, everything had already changed. The Tonight Show. Studio One at NBC Burbank. March 1985. Another Thursday night. Another packed house. Another lineup of celebrity guests promoting movies, telling rehearsed anecdotes, playing the game of late-night television that Johnny Carson had perfected over 23 years. Tony Curtis was scheduled as the second guest. The movie star. The Hollywood legend. Handsome Tony from all those classic films. He was there to promote his latest project, share some funny stories, maybe do that charming smile that had made him famous. It was supposed to be light. Easy. Safe. Johnny was at his desk doing what he did best, the perfect setup, the timing, the way he could make any guest look good. Ed McMahon was laughing at all the right moments. Doc Severinsen and the band were ready with bumper music. The audience was engaged, smiling, waiting for the next laugh. Tony had just finished telling a story about working with Marilyn Monroe. The audience had loved it. Johnny was leaning back in his chair, grinning, about to transition to the next question from his blue cue cards. "So Tony," Johnny said, shuffling his cards, "you've got this new film coming out. Tell us about." "Johnny, can I tell you something?" Tony interrupted, his voice suddenly different. Quieter. The practiced Hollywood charm completely gone. Johnny looked up from his cards. "Of course." Tony's hands were shaking. He gripped the armrests of the guest chair. "I've been on your show maybe 15 times over the years. Always promoting something. Always telling funny stories. Always playing the role. You're always welcome here, Tony. You know that. But I've never told you the truth." Tony's voice cracked. "About my son. About Nicholas." The studio went quiet. Not the planned quiet of a setup for a punchline. The uncomfortable quiet of something real bleeding into entertainment. Johnny's expression shifted. The host's mask slipped. He was suddenly just John, listening to his friend. 3 years ago. Tony continued, his eyes filling with tears. "My son Nicholas died. He was 23 years old. Heroin overdose. And I." His voice broke completely. "I wasn't there. I was shooting a movie in Europe. I got the call in my hotel room and I never got to say goodbye." Johnny Carson stopped mid-question. The entire studio froze. Johnny's hand with the cue cards slowly lowered to his desk. His jaw tightened. For exactly 3 seconds, an eternity on live television, he sat completely still, just looking at Tony Curtis crying in the guest chair 20 feet away. Then Johnny stood up. Not the casual standing he did sometimes when a bit required movement. This was different. Abrupt. Purposeful. The cameras didn't know where to go. The director in the control booth was frantically whispering into headsets. Ed McMahon half stood from his chair, confused, concerned. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet, watching. Johnny walked out from behind his desk. He crossed the stage, that space that was always carefully blocked, always precisely choreographed, and he kept walking until he was standing right in front of Tony Curtis. The audience held its breath. 300 people suddenly understanding they were witnessing something that had never happened before in 23 years of The Tonight Show. Johnny crouched down beside Tony's chair. He put his hand on Tony's shoulder. "Tony," Johnny said quietly, but the microphones caught every word. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Tony shook his head, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I didn't want people to know. I didn't want the pity. I didn't want to be the guy whose son. I just kept working. Kept doing interviews. Kept pretending everything was fine." "How long have you been carrying this?" 3 years. 3 years of smiling on talk shows and lying to everyone. Johnny looked back at his desk, at Ed, at the cameras, then back at Tony. He made a decision. "We're going to take a break," Johnny announced to the audience. "Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back." The stage manager signaled the commercial break. The moment the red lights on the cameras went dark, Johnny pulled Tony into an embrace. The audience could see them but couldn't hear what Johnny was whispering in Tony's ear. Backstage, producer Fred DeCordova was shouting, "What the hell is happening? Is this planned? Did anyone know about this?" Nobody knew. This wasn't in the pre-interview notes. This wasn't rehearsed. This was Tony Curtis having a breakdown on live television, and Johnny Carson choosing humanity over the show. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what Tony Curtis had been hiding for 3 years. Nicholas Curtis wasn't just Tony's son. He was the youngest of Tony's 6 children, born in 1970 when Tony was already a massive star. Nicholas had grown up in the shadow of Hollywood royalty, the glamour, the parties, the pressure of being Tony Curtis's son. By his teenage years, Nicholas was struggling. He'd started using drugs at 15. Pills first, then cocaine, then heroin. Tony had sent him to rehab 4 times. Each time, Nicholas would get clean for a few months, then relapse. The night Nicholas died, July 2, 1982, Tony was in Rome shooting a television miniseries. He'd been gone for 6 weeks. Nicholas had called him 3 days earlier, asking if they could talk when Tony got back to Los Angeles. "Sure, kid," Tony had said, distracted, tired from a 14-hour shoot day. "We'll have dinner when I'm home. I promise." That dinner never happened. Nicholas overdosed in his apartment in the valley. A friend found him the next morning. By the time the news reached Tony in Rome, his son was already gone. Tony flew home for the funeral. He stood at the grave site and delivered a eulogy he barely remembered. Then he went back to work. He finished the miniseries. He took another job. And another. He did talk show appearances with that famous smile, told funny stories about old Hollywood, never mentioned his dead son. For 3 years, Tony Curtis had been running from his grief by pretending it didn't exist. Until tonight. March 1985. Sitting on Johnny Carson's stage. When something inside him finally broke and the truth came spilling out on live television. The commercial break ended. The cameras came back on. The audience was completely silent, waiting, unsure what they were about to witness. Johnny hadn't returned to his desk. He'd pulled up a chair and sat down directly across from Tony, abandoning the traditional talk show format entirely. "Tony," Johnny said gently, "you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to. But if you do want to talk about it, I'm here. We're all here. And there's no clock. There's no show format. There's just 2 guys having a conversation. Okay?" Tony nodded, trying to compose himself. "I need to talk about it. I think I've needed to talk about it for 3 years and I've been too afraid." "What are you afraid of?" "That if I talk about Nicholas, everyone will know I failed him. That I was too busy with my career to save him. That I'm the reason he's dead." Johnny leaned forward. "Tony, look at me. Your son's addiction wasn't your fault. You didn't fail him. Addiction is a disease. You tried. You sent him to treatment. You did everything you could. But I wasn't there when he called me that last time. I was too tired from the shoot. I told him we'd talk later. And we never did. You couldn't have known. But I should have." Tony's voice rose, years of guilt pouring out. "I'm his father. I should have known he was in trouble. I should have gotten on a plane. I should have dropped everything and come home. Instead, I told him I'd call him later and I went to bed and 3 days later he was dead." The audience was crying. Ed McMahon had tears streaming down his face. Doc Severinsen had turned away from the camera, wiping his eyes. Johnny sat back in his chair. His jaw was tight, his own eyes glistening. "Can I tell you something, Tony? Something I've never told anyone publicly?" Tony looked up, surprised. "I had a son," Johnny said quietly. "Richard. Ricky. He died in 1991. Car accident. He was 39 years old. And like you, I wasn't there. I was here, at this studio, doing this show. And I got the call and my world stopped. Johnny's voice was shaking now. So when you say you failed your son, I understand that. I understand the guilt. I understand feeling like you should have been there. I understand wondering if you could have changed something if you just made a different choice. The studio was absolutely silent. In 23 years of hosting The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson had never shared this. Never been this vulnerable on camera. But here's what I learned, Johnny continued. We can't carry that guilt forever. It will kill us. Our sons wouldn't want that. They would want us to remember them. To talk about them. To keep them alive in our hearts and in our stories. Not to pretend they never existed because it hurts too much. Tony was sobbing now, not trying to hide it anymore. Johnny reached across and took Tony's hand. Backstage, Johnny made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. The show was supposed to have another segment. There was a comedian scheduled to perform, a musical guest waiting in the wings. The format called for Johnny to wrap up the Tony Curtis interview, go to commercial, and bring out the next guests. Fred de Cordova was frantically signaling from the wings, tapping his watch, trying to get Johnny's attention. Johnny ignored him completely. We're going to sit here, Johnny told Tony, for as long as you need. And you're going to tell me about Nicholas. Not the tragedy. Not the ending. Tell me about him. Who was he? What did he love? What made him laugh? Tony took a shaky breath. And then he started talking. He told stories about Nicholas as a little boy. How he'd loved dinosaurs and would drag Tony to the Natural History Museum every weekend. How he'd learned to play guitar and would play Bob Dylan songs badly but with complete commitment. How he made his father laugh with terrible impressions of famous actors. Johnny listened. Asked questions. Laughed at the funny memories. Let Tony cry through the painful ones. The show went 20 minutes over its scheduled time slot. NBC affiliates started getting angry calls. Producers were having heart attacks in the control room. The comedian who was supposed to perform was sent home. The musical guest never made it to stage. None of it mattered. Because something more important than a television show was happening. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. After Tony had talked for nearly 30 minutes, after he'd shared memories and pain and guilt and love, Johnny stood up and walked back to his desk. He opened his top drawer and pulled out something small. A photograph. He walked back to Tony and handed it to him. This is Ricky, Johnny said. My son. I keep this in my desk. Every night for 4 years, it's been right there. And some nights, when the show is done and everyone's gone home, I sit here alone and I look at it and I talk to him. Tell him about my day. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I miss him. Tony looked at the photograph. A young man with Johnny's eyes, smiling at the camera. Keep it, Johnny said. Johnny, I can't. Keep it. As a reminder. That you're not alone in this. That other fathers carry the same pain. And that it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to remember them. It's okay to grieve. Tony clutched the photograph to his chest and sobbed. The audience rose to their feet. Not in applause, this wasn't entertainment anymore. In solidarity. In shared grief. In witness to two fathers who had lost their sons finding each other across a television stage. Johnny and Tony embraced. The cameras kept rolling. Ed McMahon openly wept. Doc played nothing. Silence was the only appropriate music. When they finally pulled apart, Johnny looked into the camera. If you're watching and you've lost someone, talk about them. Don't hide the pain. Don't pretend it didn't happen. They deserve to be remembered. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. That night changed late-night television. Johnny never went back to being just the host after that. He became the person who showed America that vulnerability wasn't weakness. Tony Curtis kept the photograph of Ricky Carson until the day he died. It sat on his bedside table beside a photo of Nicholas. And in Johnny's desk drawer, there was now a second photograph, one Tony had given him during the commercial break. Nicholas Curtis, age 8, holding a guitar, smiling at his father behind the camera. Two fathers. Two sons. One moment that proved grief shared is grief survived.